Thank you, Bob. And I want to give a shout out to all of my students that are here under the, what's the threat? No, under the promise of extra credit for attending. We've got a great panel, and we're going to get into some really interesting nitty-gritty issues about political broadcasting. To my left is David O'Connor, a partner at Wilkinson, Barker, and Nauer, who is the Washington, D.C. Counsel for the GAB, and he and one of his partners, David Oxenford, do a blog called the Broadcast Law blog, and on that blog they have posted a document called Political Broadcasting 2020, and I would recommend for those of you who didn't get the handout that David had, I think we ran out of if you didn't get that, that's a truncated version of a much longer document that you can find on broadcastlawblog.com. That's one word, broadcastlawblog.com. And that's an excellent source of information about what's happening with the FCC and with Congress regarding broadcasting. To my immediate right is Chris Harvey of the Office of the Secretary of State. He doesn't work for Mike Pompeo. He works for the Georgia Secretary of State, and he's actually in charge of elections in Georgia, and he's brought the latest version of the election machine, and he's going to show us how the Russians will hack those in just a moment. And then to my far right is the political sage at UGA, Dr. Charles Bullock, who has been at UGA for year 52. I've been here for 43, so together we have nearly a century of experience, which is kind of scary. Let's start with Chris, if you would. If you will demonstrate this device and explain why it's superior to the prior machines that have been used in Georgia.
Sure, it's my pleasure. Thank you for having me here. I'm happy to introduce you to the newest generation of voting in Georgia. Real quick background about what's been happening for the last 17 years. In 2002, after the 2000 election, Georgia went to a uniform voting system. Georgia is one of only 5 states where every county, every person in every county votes on the exact same system, the exact same procedures, the exact same forms. Most states allow individual counties to decide how they want to vote. But if you vote in Georgia in March, which I hope most of you, all of you are eligible to, and whether you vote in Clark County, or you vote in Thomasville, or you vote in Decatur, or you vote in the mountains or down by the coast, you're going to vote on one of these ballot marker devices. I'm going to walk you through it quickly right now so we can get to the rest of the program. Please hold your questions, and if the opportunity for questions comes at the end, be happy to answer questions, be happy to stay afterwards, talk to you, and show you how this stuff works. The first thing you'll notice is that when you've gone to vote in the past, the first thing you do is you get out your ID and you fill out one of those half sheets of paper. It's a voter certificate. You write your name and your address and the date and the election, all that kind of stuff. You don't do that anymore. Now when you come to vote, you're going to approach the poll worker who's going to have one of these iPads. It's called a poll pad. And if you have a Georgia driver's license or a Georgia state-issued ID card, you're just going to drop it in this little tray. The camera is going to recognize it, scan it, and it's going to pull you up on the iPad. Now, the information on this demonstration model is all dummy information, so I can't actually demonstrate it for you. If you don't have a Georgia driver's license or ID card, you can look somebody up manually. So I'll do that here. So let's say that I've got a passport, which is not going to scan. So instead, I'll look up myself manually, and here I find I'll be Brett Horrocks. So the poll worker would identify Brett Horrocks. Now, the other thing about the system that's new is it's more interactive for the voter. If you think about it in the past, once you handed the poll worker your ID and your voter certificate, you didn't really see anything back until they handed you a yellow card and you went and voted. Well, this experience is going to be much more voter-centric. So you're going to drop your ID in here, or they're going to look up manually. The poll worker is going to turn the screen around, and you're going to be able to verify your name, your date of birth, and your address. So the possibility that they looked up the wrong person or they selected the wrong person is going to be eliminated by you verifying this information. You're going to hit the accept, indicating that that's who you are. And then, again, contrary to previously checking on a voter certificate, if it's a primary, you want Democrat, Republican, or nonpartisan, now you're going to make the selection. So you're going to touch the ticket that you want to vote in the primary, and then you're going to sign the oath on the poll pad, either using your finger or a stylus. You'll sign it, you'll turn it back around to the poll worker who's going to verify your information and is then going to create a voter access card. Turn it back around to you. And it shows that Brett Harless has been processed successfully. Now, to be clear, although this has the entire voter database on it, no personal information goes onto this card. The only thing that's on this card is the ballot information that you're going to get. So it doesn't know right now, once it pulled out, this doesn't know this is Brett Harless. This just knows the voter here is going to get ballot combination 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So the voter is then going to walk over to this large tablet. They're going to insert the card in the bottom yellow center, just like they did before, and you put it in a different place. But this is going to bring up the ballot. This is a demonstration ballot, so it's not going to look exactly the same, but this is where you'll have your instructions. And it'll tell you to advance the ballot, just go to the bottom and hit next. And it'll bring up the races. In this case, it's asking what is the state flower? And you're going to make a selection. You're going to choose wrong and choose the sunflower because everyone knows it's the cherry rose. And then you're going to move to the next one. Well, let's say, for example, that this print isn't big enough for you. You'll be able to come up here and increase the text size to make it a little bit larger. Or if you have some type of vision acuity issue and you want to change the contrast, you'll be able to come up here and change the contrast to maybe see a little bit more clearly. This gives me a headache after about 15 seconds, so I always change it back to that option. So you make your selection and you advance the ballot. Now, one thing that's interesting about this that is one of the advantages of these ballot marking devices is you cannot overvote this ballot. So if I try to vote for two things, it's not going to let me. The other thing that's interesting is that if you make a selection, you can change it by simply reselecting it. The other thing you'll notice is that it's going to, you may not be able to see it from where you're sitting, but at the top there's a little warning sign that says this contest is blank. It's telling me that I've not cast a vote on this, which is certainly my right not to vote on something, but this is going to tell me that I've left it blank. So I'm going to come down here and select that. And again, I'm not going to labor through every question. Here's one where you can vote for 4. You choose 4. So in this case, I'm only going to choose 3. And again, it tells me this contest is undervoted. It means I've got more votes to cast on this race if I want to. Again, no requirement to do that. It's going to let you undervote if you want. So you come down to the end, make all your selections, and you come to a review screen. At the very top, it says your ballot is valid, but there are warnings. And there are warnings because I've undervoted some races, and I may have left a race blank. You're able to review all of your choices, and for every contest, it'll tell you what the problem is. This contest is no good. So if I want to fix that, all I do is touch that race, it brings me back to it, and I'm able to correct my ballot and get my ballot done properly. I scroll back to the end, to the review screen, and I can check all my choices up and down. I can go back and change anything I want. When I'm satisfied that it's what I want, all I do is hit this print ballot button, and it tells me again, are you sure you want to print it? Because once you print it, you can't change it, which is almost true. So I'm going to print my ballot, and every one of these tablets, there's going to be a dedicated printer. So it's not a printer someplace different. Every one of these tablets has a printer next to it. So it's going to print out my ballot, and I'm going to be able to hold it in my hand and verify it. Now you'll notice this this small QR code in the middle of the ballot. This contains ballot information for the scanner to scan. But underneath, you'll see every vote is listed in a written out form. For example, it says, what is the state flower? Vote for the sunflower. What year was Georgia founded? Vote for 1800. So you get to come down and verify that all these selections are what you want. Once you've verified this is good, you walk over to the scanner, and you can do it in any configuration. Face up, face down, top up, bottom down, doesn't matter. You simply feed it into the scanner, and this screen says processing ballot, casting ballot, and then ballot successfully cast. 3 things happen when you scan your ballot in here. The first thing it does is it tabulates your votes according to that QR code. The second thing it does, it takes a digital image of the front and back of every ballot that comes through here. And the third thing it does is it retains it in this locked box so that afterwards, for a post-election audit, which we're going to be required after November 2020, a post-election audit can be done. If there's ever a discrepancy between what the QR code says or what the memory card says and what is written on the actual ballot, the law says that what is actually printed in human readable form is the vote. So if you do a hand audit, you're actually reading the name that's listed, the Cherokee Rose or Joe Smith or Ben Jones, whoever it is. That's what rules. And that's the system. That's voting. You see, this interaction is very much like what you've done if you voted before. The only real difference is you get a paper ballot, you verify what's on it, you walk it over, you scan it. It's what's really important for everyone to understand is until you've scanned this ballot, you have not voted. If you take your ballot home to show your friends and your fraternity brothers and your stuff, guess what you haven't done? You haven't cast a vote. It's not a receipt, it's not a souvenir, it's your ballot. So if you walk out of the polling place with it, it's dead. You don't get another chance. So again, I'll be happy to answer questions, but I want you guys to see that. None of this stuff is connected to networks. It's all offline in the voting environment. I'd be happy to talk about that more, but I know there are some other things at hand. So I'm happy to be here and be happy to answer questions as they come up.
I have a question.
Yes.
What if your state ID address is different than the state voting?
What's on your ID is irrelevant as far as address goes. What's important is that where you live is where you're registered to vote. You can vote in Georgia with an expired Georgia ID, so it could be something from 20 years ago and you don't live there anymore. What's important is that it's you, it's a valid form of ID, and what's on that poll pad is where you're registered to vote.
We'll have more questions later on, and some of you may want to come up and play.
I'll be happy to let you try it out.
Demonstrate it. Well, this year is an extraordinary year in Georgia because we're going to have 2 United States Senate seats up for election. So I'm going to ask Professor Bullock to describe this special election and what does the announcement today by Doug Collins that he's going to challenge Senator Loeffler. What does that do? There's also some indications that the Georgia legislature may amend the rules to provide for a primary. So let's get into that.
Yeah, when there are Senate vacancies, different states approach it different ways. Some states simply elect a replacement. That's all they do. And some others, the governor will make an appointment and that person will then run in a special election. Georgia, we do it differently than either of those. Okay. And we're not unique in this. What we do is a more common way, and that is the most common way. Governor makes an appointment, and that individual serves until the next regularly scheduled election. So he could serve almost 2 years. In this case, Loeffler will serve at least 11 months. Governor gets to make this choice in Georgia for Senate position, for the state constitutional offices, and for judicial positions. The governor cannot make this kind of choice, though, for a member of Congress or for a state legislature. For those, you have to have a special election. Now, under the existing law, we have in a special election a jungle primary, meaning that everybody who wants that seat runs on a single ballot. Democrat, Republican, Green, Libertarian, off the wall, whatever. You're all on the same ballot. You may remember if you lived in the 6th district 2 years ago, I think there were 18 people who ran to replace Tom Price when he stepped out. So we could easily have something like that this year.
I remember that.
Remember that? That's probably right. As a political scientist, I thought it was wonderful. The rules for a special election, as with all elections in Georgia, you have to win a majority. Special election, if you get a majority in that first round, it's all over. If you don't, then the top 2 go into a runoff election. Because this is a federal office, that runoff election would come 9 weeks later, which would be early January of 2021. And for you broadcasters, this is what you really want to hope for. Because if it goes there, you've got another 9 weeks to sell time on your stations, and we really will be the center of the political universe because we'll be the only state holding that election. And again, a political scientist dream, the November election will result in, say, 50 Democrats, 49 Republicans, or something like this. And this Georgia runoff would be determinative of which party is going to control the Senate. Doesn't get any better than that. However, history tells us that when there are runoff elections like this, where essentially you get partisanship involved, Republicans turn out better than Democrats do. So if we were to go to something like that, the odds would be that we Republicans, assuming one Democrat run Republican advances, it's not guaranteed, that's probably what happened, would be at the advantage. Now, that's the existing law as of we sit here on the 29th of January in 2020. Yesterday, in the Georgia House, a new piece of legislation was passed. And the bill that was passed yesterday would do away with the jungle primary in special elections. Instead, we would have the same kind of process we usually have. That is, there'd be a Democratic primary and a Republican primary. These would both take place in May, along with all the other primary elections. And then come November, the ballot would have the Democratic nominee, the Republican nominee. If there were a Libertarian, that person would also show up there. So that passed out of committee in the House yesterday. I think probably the Rules Committee in the House will pass it tomorrow, in which case then it goes to the Senate. See what happens there. This change is supported by Speaker Ralston. It's also supported by Minority Leader Bob Trammell. So in committee, it had only one negative vote. With the Speaker supporting it, the Speaker appoints the chair of the Rules Committee. I'll probably pass. Be my guess. Okay. This change will benefit probably Doug Collins, who announced that he's running today. The reason it probably benefits him is it shortens the amount of time for Kelly Loeffler to introduce herself to Georgians. Now, if it stays the way it is now, then she's got from now until early November. She's watching television. Her second ad, I think, went up yesterday. At least I've seen. I think it was on TV. Maybe you saw it somewhere. But anyway, she's got her second ad out. Going into this, Bob Collins is certainly not universally known throughout Georgia. His ID is much higher than hers. So if this change goes through, then rather than having about 9 months, it'll be less than 4 months for her to introduce herself. Collins also will be advantaged the sooner this election comes off from the free publicity he got as being the president's attack dog in the Judiciary Committee. Again, if this doesn't get decided until November, some set of folks will forget it. How long it may, more of them will remember it. It looks like Ralston has pretty much shown his hand in this. Before Doug Collins became a member of Congress, before he became a member of the Georgia General Assembly, before he became an attorney, he was a preacher. Yesterday, he gave the invocation at the beginning of the House meeting. The Speaker introduced him, talked about what a great friend Doug Collins was of his. Doug Collins had supported him back in 2010 when Ralston challenged then Speaker Glenn Richardson and lost that. Richardson then resigned, and at that point then Ralston did win election as the Speaker. And Ralston also, as I say, supports this change bill. Now, arguably, the Republican Party has more to lose in the jungle primary than the Democratic Party does. Probably be more Republicans than Democrats run. Typical pattern is whichever party is the majority party within a jurisdiction, more people come forward to run on its ticket. So, again, assuming that there is one dominant Democrat on that side, that person almost would certainly go forward to the runoff. The Republican vote might be more broadly split. So one Republican probably would survive, and therefore we would get to November again with the jungle primary with one Democrat and Republican. But Republicans would face greater uncertainty over who might survive that. It might be very close between, say, Collins and Loeffler. Also, there would be this prolonged period where Loeffler and Collins are running against each other. The bitterness which would be engendered in the course of many months of competing for Republican votes, trying to demonstrate who is the stronger supporter of the president or whatever else, could then have some lasting consequences. Yeah, the two individuals undoubtedly would put arms around each other and say, yeah, we're friends, I support you. But some of their followers might not be so willing to kiss and make up. the bitterness that they experienced, how did you lie about my candidate, may continue on after this. So again, it would probably work for the Republicans' advantage to get this out of the way, and then have from May until November to try to make up. Now, so I say, I think the House will probably pass this, the Senate probably will, maybe not. But a spokeswoman for the governor has said, doesn't matter if this bill gets passed, the governor will veto it. And that will probably kill it. Because remember, under Georgia law, the governor has 40 days after the end of the session, not 40 days after a bill is passed, 40 days after the end of the session, to decide whether he's going to sign it. The session will run into at least mid-March, maybe a bit longer than that. Also, in order for the Secretary of State's office to have ballots set up, this legislation has to pass reasonably soon in order to be able to show, yeah, that there is a Democratic primary and a Republican primary, or whatever. They're going to file for office in early March, right? Isn't
First week of March, yes.
First week of March, right. So if this passes and the governor just sits on it, in the legislature still in session, it isn't going to happen. Now, the speaker said, well, the governor vetoes it, will override it. There won't be a chance to do that, probably. Because by the time the governor makes a decision, the legislature's gone home. The legislature cannot reconvene itself on its own volition. Only the governor can call a special session. Now, what might happen, there might be some hostage taking. Now, usually hostage taking involves the Senate sitting on a House bill to get something the Senate wants. You might see something a bit different here. The House might, the governor is not acting on this piece of legislation, the House might say, well, we're not going to act on your proposed pay increase for teachers. Or they might, if they really want to play with dynamite, say, we're not going to pass a budget. If they don't do that, a special session would have to be called. So we might see those kinds of things. So what we may be seeing here is propping up what may become kind of a major battle between the speaker and the governor in all this. Now, in addition, your boss, the Secretary of State, has asked the legislature to specify when the qualifying will be. And he wants to have the qualifying take place this Tennessee in early March with everything else. Under the law, it specifies for a special election it has to be done 60 days before. It doesn't say you have to wait until that point. It must be done 60 days before a special election. So conceivably, one could wait and call the qualifying in early September. So the Secretary of State has asked for some clarification on this. So as we sit here, that's kind of the situation. It may change. It probably will change in the next couple of weeks. We see first, does this pass the Rules Committee? In which case, then it comes to the floor sometime next week, maybe even as early as Friday, passed by the House, we transport it to the Senate. See what happens there.
Assume we don't get a change in the law and we end up with a jungle primary. The wild card would be President Trump and his endorsement, because I would anticipate he would go with Collins. He was not pleased with Governor Kemp's choice. What role would that play?
Okay, yeah, and again, that could also play out in just a regular primary too, I think. And so one of the things which Kelly also has said is that she will spend $20 million on your stations to announce herself. All right, that's probably more money than Collins has. What would really help him would be then for the president to come to Georgia, hold a rally, because along with the rally, there would then be a fundraiser. And this would not necessarily ensure that he would get $20 million, but it would certainly make him much more competitive in terms of the kind of money which we'd have available. Interestingly, the National Republican Senate Committee, which is the Senate Republican arm of fundraising, has come out in favor of Loeffler. So they've kind of cast their lot with the incumbent. And that's what they usually do. Well, there are 4 of these committees, 2 Democratic, 2 Republican, 1 in the House, 1 in the Senate for each one. And they usually go with the incumbents, and they've sort of come down the side of that. But the president, he can certainly do his own thing, and he is a very, very successful fundraiser.
We have a late addition to our panel. This is Jeremy Collins to my left, who's the lobbyist for the GAB. Give us your take on what's going to happen in the Capitol regarding changing the rules.
I apologize. I was at the Capitol, left at 1:30, and then I couldn't find parking. Didn't want to get booted or towed, so I had some issues getting in here. So apologies for my tardiness. I do want to say I didn't go to UGA, but at the state capitol there are House members and Senate members that Dr. Bullock has taught, and he is a legend down there. As much as you can pick his brain, it's an honor for me to be sitting on this panel with him, because I got to know him as a staff member when I was working as chief of staff at the state center to the state, to President Pro Tem Schaefer at the time. But you've got a wealth of knowledge, and please pick his brain while you have him, because it's an honor for me to sit on this panel with him. Really, I can't. I mean, people are making laws and legislating that that he taught. 20 years ago, 10 years ago, 5 years ago, they're there. So I just wanted to say that. And I truly do mean that. He was stealing, I got here late and he was stealing most of my thunder, like everything I've been talking about. Yeah, he pretty much explained. I would say that one thing that I, sort of the gossip this week at the Capitol on the third floor, which you understand that, was if that election bill does pass both chambers, they could immediately transmit it to the governor, which would put a shorter timeline. And I'm not exactly sure what that, I think it's maybe 6 days the governor would have then to sign it when they immediately transmit it to him. So it would force his hand and not have that prolonged. So that's the only thing that I would add to that. Everything that he said is right. I mean, it's traditionally the governor and the speaker have been together, and then they try to get their legislation through the Senate. This year, obviously, with the personal friendship that going back decades that Congressman Collins has with the speaker, coming down and being the chaplain of the day, it's a little bit more of a dynamic. The $20 million is right. There's a lot of talk that she's going to have to put more money in now because Doug Collins, it's assumed he will have the president's support. We don't know if that's an assumption, which is a joke there. So you don't really know if that's going to happen, but it's assumed that that's the president's choice. I would say big things at the Capitol is the governor and his, there's a OPB, the governor's budget office, that's what it stands for. They've asked for a 4% cut on all agencies of the budget because they foresee, they're seeing the monthly tax revenue numbers coming in at a much lower rate than they were in the last year. And it's kind of interesting because we have a historic unemployment rate right now in Georgia. So we're creating a lot of jobs. We've as a state, we've recruited a lot of companies to come in. That's also been on the heels of a lot of tax incentives to draw those businesses in. So whereas the average Georgian might not feel the pain of what's coming up, which is the dip in collected tax, the state is feeling it. So that's why the governor proactively asked for a 4% cut. So the budget is the biggest issue. I mean, well, obviously we have politics, we have the Senate race, and and with Congressman Collins running for Senate, there's already one House member chairman and one Senate chairman today. They've already announced that they're going to run for that congressional race, which means they'll open up special elections for those state House races and state Senate districts, which again will all benefit the broadcasters because they're going to have to spend money. But there's a huge trickle down effect. And to Dr. Bullock's, one of his comments earlier, I mean, they could hold that election bill over the budget and say, we really want this. And who knows where that pressure point is, where it pops. I mean, we have similar things each year, but this is kind of big, and obviously you live in the present, so this is what we're doing with the present. But the budget is a big thing, and what programs are going to be cut to get those 4% cuts across across all state government agencies. I'm happy to answer any questions. Have I answered your initial question, man? Okay.
That's great. Oh, well, we're going to shift now and start talking about the important legal issues that surround all of this. The first one I'm going to pose to David is, Representative Collins announced he's running for the Senate seat. Is he a legally qualified candidate?
Good question. Thank you all, first of all, for having me down here. It's always great to be back here in Georgia. A few years ago, Bill and Bob invited me down here, and I realized when I got here I didn't have a tie. So I went to the UGA bookstore, all the UGA ties. And now that's what I wear every time.
He wears it every year.
I see someone else shops in the same store. So thank you all for having me here. Doug Collins just declared today.
Yes.
So he needs to qualify on the ballot in order to be eligible to be determined a legally qualified candidate. It doesn't really matter at this point. It does, but it doesn't in terms of how much you can charge any candidate in this race. The lowest unit charge window opens 45 days before primary, 60 days before general election. This one is interesting though. This is a special election, and the FCC has informally said, we think this election on November 3rd is actually more of a primary, because there's a very good chance that this could lead to a runoff, as we've been hearing. And so, as a result, they think it would be unfair to require broadcasters to have a lowest unit charge window for 60 days in front of what they view as a primary. So they view this as a primary, which means for the broadcasters, you don't have to extend lowest unit charge to any of these candidates, legally qualified or not. We'd have to prove they're legally qualified to get the LUC. But they don't get that LUC until 45 days before November 3rd, which is September 19th.
Now that's just for that Senate seat.
That is correct. That's a special election, correct, yes. So if we look at the broader picture on page 2, for those who have the handout, and those who don't, please email the GAB. I'm happy to send it to anybody who needs it. If you look on page 2, March 24th, as we've heard, is the presidential primary election. So that means the lowest unit charge window, the 45 days before, is February 8th. So it's coming up very soon. That's when you have to really start to look at your lowest unit charge for each class of time that you sell, each day part. And we can go into a lot of details about that as we go on. But it's going to be very important that you extend lowest unit charge to any eligible legally qualified candidate during that 45 days before the primary, 60 days before a general election. And that doesn't just apply to federal candidates, that applies to state and local candidates as well. You're not obligated to take state and local candidates. You are required to take federal candidate advertising. They have reasonable access requirements. But for state and local, you can say we'll take the governor's race, we won't take one of the house, or whatever you decide. We won't take the mayor's race, but we'll take others. But if you do open that race up to any candidate, you have to extend lowest unit charge to any legally qualified candidate in that running for that office.
Late last year, the FCC changed the political file requirements for issue ads sponsored by non-candidates. The NAB has filed a reconsideration petition that's currently before the FCC. Can you explain how the political file requirements have changed?
Sure. So page 3 is of my handout is sort of the beginning of what broadcasters are obligated to do in terms of disclosure of advertising that appears on their station. You might take a step back and say, why do broadcasters have to do this? If you look at Twitter, look at Facebook, they don't have these federal obligations. The Communications Act, Twitter in fact said we're not going to take any political advertising. And broadcasters don't have that option. We are required to give reasonable access to federal candidates. Again, we have some flexibility with state and local, but we have a lot of regulations that apply to us that simply don't apply to other online platforms. So we do have these online public file obligations. The FCC has moved everything from the dusty old paper files that you maybe remember fondly now to online public files that anybody can review 24/7. And people are definitely reviewing these. There are watchdog groups out there that are looking at station online public files. A lot of you have renewal applications for radio pending right now. You need to make sure that your political files are up to date and accurate. And that means getting everything up there within one business day. It's very important to get your information up in a timely manner because the FCC's online public file gives a date stamp of when you put something up into the file. So if you're late, the FCC and other watchdog groups may be interested in that fact and they file a petition to deny your application. So very important. So getting to what Bill asked about, the issue ads and the clarification that the FCC came out with in October. And this only applies to issue ads. It does not apply to candidate ads. And it only applies to a particular type of issue ad. It's a national issue of political importance. That's a very particular phrasing that is in the Communications Act. It was passed as part of the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act 2002, I believe.
Yes.
And it does enhance the disclosure requirements that broadcasters have to do for national political issue advertising. Things that would trigger this requirement, if someone mentions abortion, immigration, mentions President Trump, mentions any federal candidate, any federal office, all of these things have to now be disclosed, and the FCC is clarified. You have to disclose every single one of those issues in your disclosure form. The disclosure form that most broadcasters use is called the PV18, the Political Broadcast 18 form. If you're not using it, I highly encourage you to use it. We do expect to see a new PV form. This is breaking news, sort of. It hasn't been announced yet, but you will see a PV19 form at some point this year. So be on the lookout for that, and when it comes out, start to use it. But that disclosure form for issue advertising, political issue advertising of national importance, requires you now, under this clarification, to list every single issue, every single office mentioned in the ad, every single federal candidate mentioned in the ad. That increases your disclosure obligations. It increases the issues for your staff in trying to look at ad copy very quickly and put that information into the online public file, knowing that you have a quick turnaround on this. So it's important to get this message to your staff that this is serious. We do expect some fines to be coming out, some pretty major ones from what we've been hearing in Washington. So the FCC is not taking this lightly. And I'll just give you one example of how complicated this can get. We had an ad that featured, it was a message saying that John Bolton should testify in the impeachment hearings that are going on now in the Senate. It featured Jim Jordan, maybe 4 or 5 other Republican House members. It mentioned John Bolton, it mentioned the impeachment, it mentioned President Trump. Every single one of those issues, with the exception maybe of John Bolton, has to be listed in your public forum disclosure about that particular ad under this clarification that the FCC has issued.
There's a second part to that order, and that is that if the sponsoring organization claims to have just one board member, then the broadcaster has to go back and say, "Are you serious?" Explain that.
Yeah, this is a new obligation on broadcasters again, and this only applies to national political issue advertising. It does not apply to the state ballot issues or the local issues. We do have online disclosure obligations for those, but they're not as detailed as what you have for national political issues. So yes, you are obligated to go back to the issue advertiser and say, "Are you serious? Do you only have one officer?" You have to disclose every single chief executive officer. That means usually the president, secretary, vice president, treasurer of these organizations. And bottom line is, the advertisers don't have any incentive to comply with these rules. The media agencies that you deal with don't have any incentive to comply with these rules. You're the only ones as broadcasters that are ultimately liable, will face an FCC fine if your online public file is not complete. So it's really important for you to understand these rules and comply with them to avoid a fine. And so yes, you do have this affirmative obligation to go back to the advertiser and say, "Do you really only have one officer?" And if the answer is yes, that's all you need to do. You should document it, keep it in your private files. I think the PD19 will actually have a form, have a piece of the form that actually asks you to document your efforts to get that information. So that'll hopefully be of help to folks in their compliance. But in the meantime, this is something you have to do, and it's in effect right now, even though, as Bill said, there's petitions for reconsideration. And
enunciate that PD or
PV, P as in Paul, B as in boy. PB18, you used to have to pay for it, but I think the NAB will give it to you for free. I can send it to you too if you like.
Next question here.
For documenting that ask of the agency for that extra information, what's appropriate documentation? An email to that agency or?
Yes, I think that would be appropriate. I think a telephone call is not as easily documented, and there could be a situation in which you're asked to produce evidence that you did ask affirmatively for more information. So I think an email trail would be perfectly acceptable.
And ask is sufficient, not necessarily asking a response.
I think
At 5:30 p.m. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, again, these media buyers have no incentive to comply with these rules, so it may be difficult to track them down. But I don't think a one-time inquiry with no response would be necessarily acceptable. So if you don't get a response, I think you need to tickle it until you get an answer.
Now, this only applies to broadcast ads. It wouldn't apply to ads that a station might sell for its website or streaming platform.
Correct. The FCC's jurisdiction is limited to over-the-air broadcasting. So you can charge whatever you like for on your website for banner advertising or anything else. The one caution I would give you is that for candidate ads, you cannot censor a candidate ad, state, local, federal. You have to run it as you receive it from the candidate. With issue ads, you can censor it, and you should if you see something that's potentially including defamation or could potentially put you in trouble with other candidates or with someone else, or copyright issues, for example. But when you run a candidate ad on your website, you don't have that limitation of liability. You need to be careful if you're streaming, for example, your candidate ads. While you would have the protection of immunity from liability from candidate ad information or content broadcast, you wouldn't have that same immunity from liability on your streaming necessarily.
Question here.
Going back to documenting that you have all the officers, you could have a policy where if the agency is non-responsive, we can refuse to air the ad. Is that correct?
Correct, because we're talking about issue ads only.
Yeah.
So your incentive is to air these because
Right.
they're more lucrative even than candidate ads. But we also need to be careful about FCC fines, and the ground is very murky right now, I'd say. So I would be careful and make sure that you're complying with these rules until we get some clarification based on this NAB petition that Bill mentioned.
But in terms of whether you accept an issue ad from a non-candidate party, you can be as thoughtful or as irrational as you want. Okay? If it's just your win, no, we're not doing it. Generally, you're not going to do that because these groups aren't entitled to your lowest unit rate.
Right.
And so you can charge above market rates.
Right. I think refusing is going to give the agency, if nothing else, incentive to want to give us that information.
Yeah. They'll think twice again if they
Yeah.
want to comply. To that point too, there's no obligation, there's no fairness doctrine anymore. So you can run, a pro-environment ad and not be required to run an anti-environment ad or anti-development ad. Whatever you can run whatever you want in terms of issue ads, or decide not to run whatever you want.
Let's go here. Question here.
So, as it pertains to lowest unit rate, so if you take direct response advertising, which typically you're given a lower rate and it's highly preemptible, could go on whether the product is moving or not, we need to take that DR rate also into consideration for the candidate, the lowest unit rate?
Yeah, so this is a great question. You have different classes of time, and you need to be clear about what class of time you're selling. So if you have a fixed rate, non-preemptible, if you say you buy this rate, you're guaranteed to run. You're absent any kind of technical problems, but you're guaranteed to run. That is a different class of time than one that's highly preemptible. So if you're clear to the advertiser and to candidates, we've got two separate types of classes of time. One is non-preemptible, it's much higher, but you're guaranteed to run. One is a lower rate, but you might be preempted, and you tell them what the percentage chance of getting preempted is. Those are two different classes of time, so the preemptible rate does not affect your
So
non-preemptible
we
rate.
just gotta make sure as you're booking that into your traffic system or whatever, it is classified as such, so you have to go back and prove it that you could.
Yes, absolutely. And the PB18 form we've been talking about requires you to disclose the class of time you sold, as well as the time that it ran. So you could have a non-preemptible rate for morning drive time that's different than your non-preemptible rate for afternoon drive time, for daytime drive.
Let's go to an issue you had raised, and that is that people would complain about the content of a candidate's advertisement and what can a broadcaster do. And I'm prompted by a story today about the mother of the boy portrayed in the Success Kid meme. If you're not familiar with that, you'll find out about it after this. Has found that copyrighted photograph of her son has been used by Representative King on his website and campaign materials, and she's sent him a cease and desist letter saying, I own the copyright, you're using it without my consent, remove it. Now, what happens if she had come to a TV station that was running one of this candidate's ads and said, there's a copyright violation in that ad, and I want you to remove that ad? What could the station do?
So it's important to make sure that it's a candidate ad as opposed to an issue ad favoring this candidate. But if it truly is a candidate ad, and it's from an authorized committee of the candidate, broadcasters have immunity from any liability for the content of the candidate ad. And so I think the answer would be, we're very sorry, but we're not permitted to censor anything in this candidate's ad. And that can get very difficult for broadcasters, because sometimes you get candidates that want to feature very graphic material, sometimes abortion material. It's very, very difficult for the station to just put this on during prime time, because it does affect the audience. But you have to you cannot channel that information to the late night hours. You have to take candidate ads during the daytime, assuming you're taking candidate ads from a particular race. But again, for federal candidates, you have reasonable access obligations. You have to take federal candidate ads. So you can put a disclaimer before this graphic information. You could put a disclaimer before the advertising for this one saying we recognize this as copyright material, but we're required by federal law to run this information. But if you do that, you do have to do that for every other candidate in the race, so that you're not singling out one particular candidate.
There was a question out there. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just had one question on the public file nature.
They love this public file.
The NAB form going up. Of course, for years we've kept paper files in drawers outside, and we still do it. Are we really required to do that any longer with now the full television broadcast side being all online?
So yes, you are obligated to do everything online now. Any paper files at this point are past the 2-year record retention requirement. You only have to keep these political files in your online public file for 2 years. So we're now past actually we're just coming up on March 1st, 2020. So March 1st, 2018 was the first day that radio stations across the country had to put their political file information online. So as of March 1st, anything prior to March 1, 2018 is no longer required to be in the file. So those paper files are now historical documents.
What if a group comes to the station and says, this candidate ad has false information in it? You need to check out these facts. Does the station have any obligation to do any fact checking of a candidate advertisement?
Not for a candidate advertisement. Again, I think that broad immunity from liability protects you as the broadcaster. Again, caution if you are putting any of that information online, if you're streaming it, you may need to pay more attention. But if you're just talking about an over-the-air advertisement by a candidate, you cannot censor that content, and as a result, you're immune from liability for the content of that ad. It gets more difficult when you talk about an issue ad, and someone says, this ad contains defamatory content or copyrighted material. That's when you have to go back to the advertiser and say, can you substantiate what you're saying in this advertisement? Particularly when it comes to two opponents with issue advertisers, one supporting one supporting the other, and they're slinging mud at each other and saying, this candidate missed 42 sessions days in the last session. He's a big spending liberal, and so you're obligated to go back to the advertiser and say, substantiate what you're saying in this issue ad. And if they come back, and they usually do, with some thick documentation saying, here's the New York Times article that we referred to in the ad, it becomes sort of a he said, she said. And so the broadcaster is not the policeman trying to decide which one is correct. So normally what we would say, unless it's clearly defamatory or potentially problematic, we normally would just say, we're going to continue running the ad, but we invite you to purchase time to respond to what he's saying in the ad. That way you get more advertising.
We have two lawyers, you're one of them. I want to agree with you, but our other lawyer with the National Association of Broadcasters seems to have a slightly different opinion about the whether a candidate is a minister. And secondly, you might want to also talk about more 30,000 feet level that the PAC is doing some, I can say, sneaky things to try and look like a candidate, and it sounds like they're winning in a lot of ways. So those are two totally different questions. They just kind of popped in my head as I was asking this question.
Sure. So as the first one, I mean, I'm not sure what the context of that the NAB guy was saying, but I mean, I think there's a pretty broad immunity going back to a Supreme Court case in
1959.
The WDA law, is it?
Yes.
And that really has not changed since. So if you're talking about a legally qualified candidate, they can say whatever they want, and it can be in any language they want. We recently had a case where a station wanted to pull a candidate out because it was in Spanish. It can be in Martian. It can be in anything they want. They can say whatever they want because they're kind of legally qualified candidates.
So now that doesn't mean though that the candidate is immune from defamation, okay? But the reality is generally candidates are talking about other candidates, and therefore the rules of New York Times v. Sullivan apply, which makes it almost impossible for a candidate for office to win defamation damages. Okay, so if a candidate's ad is found defamatory, the station has no liability, but the candidate could be liable. Did you want to?
No, I was just getting to go.
Oh.
Your second question?
Yeah.
The second question was that some PAC advertising is beginning to look like candidates and trying to get a lower unit rate and I think succeed.
Yes, I mean, it's very attractive for issue advertisers to try to get that lowest unit charge rate because it is oftentimes significantly lower than what you would charge an issue advertiser. You can charge an issue advertiser whatever the market will bear. And so there is a financial incentive for these PACs to pretend to be associated with the candidate. The problem is sometimes they are. And so as a broadcaster, you're permitted to go back to the advertiser and say, can you confirm in writing that you are an authorized committee of the candidate? And sometimes they do come back, and there are certain states that have unlimited expenditure. Pennsylvania is one of them. And we've seen cases where candidates will liberally say that these PACs are associated with their committee and with their candidacy. And so they'll write letters saying, yes, this PAC is associated with my candidacy. And in those events, we've said you have to give those from the charge. So you do have the right to go back to the candidate, or to the media buyer, and say, confirm in writing that you are an authorized committee of this candidate. But if they do bring back confirmation, I think you do have to extend those.
If it's not a authorized committee, then you have a legal obligation to sell them time, and you can refuse to sell them time just because you just don't want to.
Correct.
Who has the right to authorize that? The candidate only themselves?
Yes, I would say it has to be from the writ signed by the candidate or by the treasurer of the committee for the candidate.
And a lot of times you have these PACs that people know that are the preferred PACs from the candidate. So the candidate will go into a reception and they will speak at reception and leave, and that was a fundraiser. But they're not part of it. So because the giving levels are so much higher when there's not the and I can't tell you the specific giving levels off the top of my head right now. But if they have these outside PACs and they identify one, they'll show up at events, they will speak, and then they'll leave, and the money is the contribution level is just so much higher. So a lot of times they try to keep them separate. It's just another way, and there's no coordination, so they're not approving the mail that's going out. They're not approving the television ad. They've just got maybe a former staffer over there running that PAC, or an operative that they trust that's running that PAC, and they just trust that the message will go out on the money that they're raising. So a lot of times they try, especially federal level, they try to keep those separate so that they can get that extra money in there and just rely on somebody without coordination. It's a little bit different from the legal side of what you're talking about, but just to explain to them, I know we've got a lot of students in the room that might not have worked on campaigns before, but just to give a little background on why that's separate is because they can get more money. They just have to rely on somebody else's judgment on how to spend that money.
So it does speak to how much the lines have blurred between PACs and candidates.
Question on the issue again. If there's a group that is purchasing airtime and they're basically slinging mud against the candidate, that candidate then sends its cease and desist to the station. Is the station open to any liability if they continue to run that issue ad, or even though the attorneys from the other campaign are sending down the cease and desist?
So this is an issue ad that slings some mud at a candidate.
Yeah.
The candidate says, pull down the ad.
Yes.
You would have an obligation as broadcaster to go to the advertiser and say, please substantiate what you're saying about the candidate.
Okay.
And I think you can continue to run the ad while you say, you can respond to the candidate and say, we received your letter, we're asking the advertiser to substantiate the information in the ad, and we'll let you know when we receive a response.
Is there a window of time that's acceptable? I mean, can it go 3 months? We still haven't gotten a response, but we're still running the ad.
No, I think that would be too long. I mean, these.
I didn't know if there's a finite, like, it's got to be within this window.
My experience is these issue advertisers know this is coming. They know that they're slinging mud, and they're going to have a stack of materials that they're going to send you.
Yeah.
I would say within 24 hours usually.
Okay.
That substantiates what they're, or at least tries to substantiate what they're saying.
Your real concern here has to be for defamation,
Right.
okay? Because unlike the candidate ad, where there is no liability on behalf of the licensee, with a super PAC ad or a PAC ad, you're responsible just like the entity that created the ad. You broadcast it, and you could get dragged into court. You could be charged with that you knew the statements were false, or you had good reason to know that they were false. Nonetheless, you carried the advertisement, and therefore you are guilty of what's called actual malice. And then a jury gets to assess damages, and you don't want to be in that. You don't want to be in that situation.
Now, Winston, one of the benefits of using the PB18 form that I mentioned is that the issue form for the PB18 has an indemnification provision. That says that the advertiser indemnifies the broadcast station from any content that is potentially defamatory. How far that gets you in court is an open question. The candidate is probably going to go after deep pockets, which means they're going after not only the issue advertiser but the station as well. And whether that indemnification provision holds up in court is an open question. So that's not to get there.
Thank you.
We've not talked about reasonable access yet, and that's I think something that's very confusing to people because it's based on a distinction between federal candidates and state and local candidates. So let's just talk for a moment, if we could, about what are the obligations for reasonable access, and how are those different than equal opportunities?
Sure. So page 8 of the handout you have it there is about reasonable access, and as Bill said, it only applies to federal candidates. So your state and local candidates, you can choose again to take their advertising or not, as long as you treat them fairly. So if you take a mayor's race from the Democratic side, for example, you can take it from the Republican side as well, and same in the primaries. But for federal candidates, they are different. They have, members of Congress protected themselves in the Communications Act and ensured that they have access to the broadcast airwaves. So it doesn't mean you have to give them blanket access to your airwaves. You have to provide reasonable access, and so that means reasonable access to all of your day parts. You can't just say we'll put you in, the morning, but not in the afternoon or evening. You have to give them access to all day parts. You don't have, if a federal candidate comes in and says, I want to advertise on the Super Bowl, you have very limited inventory on that, as everyone knows, and so you can just say, we can't accommodate you. I do hear that both Trump and Bloomberg are planning to have advertisements.
That's true.
And they are both legally qualified candidates at this point because they qualified in 10 states or more on the ballot. So they are entitled to, assuming they're in a window, which is an interesting question actually for a network buy. I think the commission has said that networks do not have to extend those to the charge because they would have LUC windows open almost all the time during the election. So, but anyway, that's an example of a situation where you can say, this is such particular programming that we don't have enough inventory to accommodate every single federal candidate who would want to appear during the Super Bowl. What reasonable access does for federal candidates is that when you give time to one federal candidate, you create equal opportunities for every other legally qualified candidate in that race to claim time and to ask for proportionate coverage on the station. So you need to be carefully monitoring your inventory, particularly as you get closer to the election, to make sure that you do have enough time within your inventory to accommodate reasonable access requests from federal candidates.
I'm going to throw some numbers out because I think this is an extraordinary year. We have Michael Bloomberg, who has in basically less than 2 months spent $250 million, 209 million on broadcast TV, and then some pocket change on digital. And he has pledged to spend $500 million on the primaries and $1 billion in the general, if necessary. And just to put that in perspective, since he announced in late November, he has spent 3/4 of what all the other candidates combined, including President Trump, spent in 2019. Okay. Now, like some perspective on this in terms of the kind of money we're talking about. And are we now in a nuclear arms race where we're talking about untold amounts of money being spent on political advertising?
Sounds like it, yeah, right. Now, not all businesses have that kind of access, but if you do either do such an aggressive fundraiser or successful as Trump is, or you have independent wealth, as a few people do. Yeah, so a few people will be able to do this. Most will not. I mean, we've seen how many Democrats have already dropped out because they could not keep up with this kind of stuff. But yeah, I guess the sky is the limit, which is good for you.
I'd add that in 2015 and 16, when President Trump was running for office, he got a lot of earned media. It was free media. He was constantly on MSNBC, Morning Joe. He was constantly on Fox. Like he would do the Sunday morning, political shows. He was the only one that was allowed to call in and not actually be on camera. So he got a ton, although he is rich and he spent a lot of his own money, he got a lot of free advertisement because of his, personality and name ID. And Doug Collins, as we talked about earlier, he's appreciated a lot of that as well through these impeachment hearings, being, the president's person in the House, defender. So you've got a lot of that earned media that only a couple of people can get, and then you've got to spend it. So I mean, there is opportunity out there for only a handful of people, not even that, to be on air without spending.
We're talking about political science here. And that is, this doesn't necessarily apply to presidential candidates, but other campaigns. The more that a challenger spends against an incumbent, the better the challenger does. The more that the incumbent spends, the worse the incumbent does. And that's because the incumbent spends only in relation to what the challenger is doing. If the incumbent doesn't have serious opposition, the incumbent doesn't buy time. But as the challenger mounts up a campaign, usually incumbents almost can always outspend the challenger. And if the challenger can raise enough to kind of ante up and get in the game, then the incumbent has far more resources to raise money than the challenger does and can therefore outspend them. Although that outspending, if the challenger reaches that threshold to become competitive, may not make that much difference.
Let's see what questions the crowd has. You all have been sitting very diligently. Let's go here.
Could you?
Is it about political file?
No. On the Kelly Loeffler, she's in so early on air. Just refresh my brain. We got requests for LUC clearance prior to March 24th, which would start February 8th. Is that right? Is she eligible for LUC on February 8th?
No, that's what she's running in the November 3rd election.
Yes.
And so the commission has said the LUC window for that particular race does not open until September 19th. So until then, you cannot gouge the candidates. You can't charge higher than you would a commercial advertiser. You have to charge comparable rates to what you would charge to your commercial advertiser. But no obligation to provide LUC until September 19th.
And I think you did address a special election on the rest. Thank you.
Yeah.